Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. So today, I'm once again joined with my good friend Doug Heagren. Hey, Doug.
Hey, Kirk. We're another good day being with you, and we're live. So this is a paradigm shift in the way we've been doing this podcast. So it's exciting to be here and have every mistake that we make get recorded for brought back to us in the future.
For posterity's sake, yes. And just for the listeners' reference, this week we're doing our first LinkedIn Live event. So for those of you on LinkedIn around this time on Friday at 1, if you want to go to my LinkedIn page, you can check out. There'll be an invitation for the live event. Eventually, we'll also be on YouTube. But since we're technologically inept in some places, that may take a few weeks. But just wanted to let everyone know that you can check us out there Fridays at 1 Eastern, or you can get the invite via LinkedIn, and if it's a different time, it'll let you know. So let's kind of dive down the road here. So Doug, we've been talking for a number of weeks, quite a few months actually, about inflation. And I think for those of the listeners who have not heard the initial inflation talk, we wanted to kind of bring it back to basics a little bit, and then we'll dive into the recent news. There's a lot in the news to talk about, but let's kind of get back into the basics. So where should we start, Doug?
Well, Kirk, I think, there's a lot of confusion about what inflation is. And I mean, obviously, people are feeling it right now. As I was kind of joking to you about before we went on. I mean, one of the politicians was mentioning how expensive his lunch was to run to Taco Bell. So I don't think anybody is immune to feeling that things have definitely gotten more expensive. And going in winter, we've talked. There's been talk about the impact of inflation on heating bills. So definitely going to see more people feel that pinch. But Kirk, I think a question that people want to know is, ultimately, what's the impact of this higher inflation? I mean, how is that going to potentially lead to some changes in the way people have to think about investing? I mean, is this something we've talked about before? Is this a paradigm shift that's coming up?
Yeah, it's we talk about this a lot of being a paradigm shift, and I want to get to that in a minute. But I wanted to address your first part of the question, which is, we in the U.S., I think we live in this kind of oasis. We're separated from the rest of the world in that what everyone else is seeing in the rest of the world, like Germany or France. I mean, you can go on Twitter and you can see the videos of gas lines in France. You can see in the UK and Germany, you can see electric bills of pub owners or cafe owners that are up like 10 to 20 times what they once were, and how they have to close because they can't afford their electric bill. I mean, you can see all of that. And a lot of that is coming from inflation. They're seeing it a lot worse than we are here. And, policy, you can leave politics aside, but depending on the policies laid out by our politicians, that will drive the direction of inflation from here. They can't really make it go away, which we're going to talk about, but they can definitely make it worse. And if you know politicians, they're really good at making things worse. I don't care what side you're on, they're really good at it. So let's talk a little bit about the paradigm shift. Now, we've had a large amount of money printing for decades. And you could say, well, COVID, there was a larger amount than normal. I'm not going to make that argument. Let's just say that they've been printing money for a long time. And for whatever reason, it hasn't caused inflation. Now, all of those deflationists, the perma bears, the people out there who think the dollar is going to go to zero, we're going to have hyperinflation tomorrow. I could tell you right now that while that sounds good intellectually, it's not the case. And if you look back in 2008, a lot of people thought the market was going to go to zero. They thought the dollar was going to go to zero. We're going to have hyperinflation. The markets are going to crash. And this was in December of 2008. This wasn't before the crash. This was after the crash. They thought we'd have another crash. And they proved all to be wrong. And the reason is they really don't understand inflation. Inflation's good for scaring the pants off people, but realistically, inflation is a lot more complex. Now let's talk about it. So 2020, COVID hit, the whole global economy shut down. Think about that. For millennia, we've had a global or at least regional functioning economy where people go out and they buy and sell goods, And they were allowed to do that. It was a free market. In 2020, in March, that was all shut down. People were forced to stay in their homes. They were forced to not work. There was all this shenanigans that happened. And yet, at the end of the year, everything was back to normal. But it wasn't, right? It seemed normal, but it really wasn't. So what happened is a lot of money was printed. And you might think, well, there should be a lot of inflation. No, that's not what caused inflation. So here's what caused inflation. And I want to illustrate this because I think a lot of people don't understand. There are many, many impacts on inflation. Printing money is just one. It's not inconsequential. There is issue with printing money and causing inflation. However, that element is actually not only tied to printing money. So what's important is two factors. People talk about the printing money factor, but what they don't talk about is this second mysterious factor. No one ever talks about it. And the reason they don't is because it would ruin their thesis of the world's going to end. So they're going to scare you saying the world's going to end. Look at all the money. The reason being is let me give you an example. Let's say I'm the Federal Reserve and I decide we need more inflation and I print up $100 quadrillion, which is far in excess of what's out there now. Okay. I print up $100 quadrillion and I take that money and I stick it in a bank vault and I lock it. Do we have inflation, Doug?
I don't think so, Kirk, because there's not a lot of money to be spent if you do that.
Yeah, but I printed up all this money, Doug. Is there inflation?
Well,
there's got to be, right?
I mean, is there? I would seem to make sense. I mean, that's what I keep hearing from everybody is the narrative that all this printed money is why we have inflation, Kirk. But I have a feeling you're going to tell everybody why that may not be the case.
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head, Doug. So printing money does not cause inflation. That's the myth. That's what we call a half-truth. It's only half the truth. It's true in part, but not completely. And here's the rub. This secret second piece that I haven't told you about yet, this is the secret of why we don't have hyperinflation for printing up all the money we printed. Now, the second piece is called the velocity of money. Okay? Try not to get in the weeds, keep it high level. So let's say I'm the Fed, I print up $1. And I give it to you, Doug, for, I don't know what you could buy for $1 nowadays, but let's just say a candy bar. Let's say I could actually buy a candy bar for $1. I give it to you, you give me a candy bar. That dollar has made one movement, right? That's a circulation of one. And then you're going to take that dollar and you're going to give it to somebody else for something else. And it's going to go over and over. The more that dollar circulates through society, the faster the velocity of money. Okay. So as that velocity of money picks up, it causes the amount of money printed, that inflation to pick up. So let's say my example, we print all this money and stick it in a bank vault. It has a velocity of 0. So that money doesn't exist. It doesn't count. Technically it counts, but it's not moving and no one's touching it. So you might as well not have it exist. Okay. So what you really need to look at is the amount of money printed plus times the velocity. That's the number you need to look at. But people don't look at that because it doesn't forward their narrative. So technically, while we should have inflation by the money printing, we don't. And we do now. And people are actually mixing up why this is the case. They're thinking it's because we printed, and it isn't. And if you look at the numbers, it'll be very clear. And actually, we'll put these in when we put it up on YouTube, we'll show you all the charts so you'll be able to see that. Now, I want to talk about other factors that cause inflation. There are many factors that cause inflation. So one of the other ones that actually is the most important here for COVID is what we call globalization. Now, for the last 20 years, there's been globalization, which means that we've effectively outsourced our manufacturing to China and other countries. China is the big one. And so what would have cost us $10 a widget to create here cost $1 in China. So effectively what we've done is we've outsourced our manufacturing to China, which is great for them because, they can produce stuff and make money. And it's great for us because as consumers, we can spend a lot less on our goods. So what would have cost maybe $50 for that widget, now it cost me $20. Great, I just saved a lot of money. And for the last 20 years, we've all gotten spoiled because we've had cheap goods. Now, what's happened in the last few years, especially because of COVID, although it happened a little bit before that, is that trend of globalization has actually reversed. So now we're moving manufacturing out of China back to the US and to other countries which are more expensive, which means our goods are going to cost more. But they're not just going to cost more and then next year they're going to cost less. This is a paradigm shift. This is not something that changes quickly or easily. So now what effectively has happened is our supply chain has been messed up, broken in the last few years. And it takes a while for that to fix itself. It's not going to happen tomorrow. In my estimation from talking to people, it's going to last at minimum of 5 years, which means that inflation's not going away for at least 5 years. The supply chain is the biggest challenge that we all face. Until that's fixed, until it's more or less realigned with, our companies have done a great job at being really efficient with their supply chain. They made it too efficient, so much so it was fragile. And if you read Nassim Taleb's book, I think it's called Fragile or Fragility. Doug can correct me, but Anti-Fragile is what it's called. So the fragile thing, it was as cheap as probably we could get our goods, but yet it was fragile, which means that any sort of sand in the gears would break it, right? And COVID was sand in the gears. So supply chain was broken, and now they have to fix it. Now they're trying to make the supply chain more resilient. That takes time. They will make it resilient. These companies are very good at what they do. So they will make it more resilient, but that means your goods are going to cost more. It means it's going to take a while for this to fix itself. So that is the biggest factor in inflation, and nobody's talking about it. They're mentioning it, but they're saying it in passing, and then they blame the Fed for all the money printing. Not saying the Fed is not a part of the problem. I'm just saying that this is not the problem that they're causing. They've caused other problems. I think we can all talk about that for hours, but the supply chain is really the biggest part of it. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there because I think people kind of misinterpret where inflation comes from. But I think that's the good start. Now, I want to make one more point before we go back to Doug here, which is the paradigm shift. So we're in a situation right now where we have high inflation, right? As of yesterday, it's 8.3% inflation, and that's really high. Even historically, that's high. And that's damaging to our economy, especially since we had inflation like 2% or even lower some years in the last 10 years. So here's the problem. When you have high inflation leads to higher inflation. So think about it this way. I have $10 in my hand. If I know that next year that $10 is going to be worth $9, well, I'm going to spend that $10 today because I want to spend it while it's worth more. So I keep spending more money, which leads to higher inflation because now other people have more money and now they're spending it. So inflation is a positive feedback loop. So what will eventually happen is high inflation will lead to hyperinflation if nothing is done. So we had close to 0% interest rates for a long time. And then last year we had 8% inflation. Now, if we didn't do anything, if we kept interest rates at zero, effectively at some point inflation would be 100, 200, 300, 400%. Okay. Some of the world's most famous hyperinflationary events end up with hundreds or even thousands of percent inflation. That is the worst case scenario, but that is one side of the scenario. If we do nothing as a country and as a monetary policy, high inflation will lead to higher and higher and hyperinflation. Now, the other scenario is that the Federal Reserve's job, as they deem it to be, is to control interest rates and inflation. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to tame inflation and lower it, which would benefit all of us, including the economy and our wallets. So what they're trying to do, their stated purpose, is they're trying to raise interest rates in order to destroy demand, I think are the words they used, or reduce demand. What that means is they're trying to push us into a recession. So the other choice we have as a country is we can decide, hey, we want to push the economy into recession, which reduces demand, which reduces inflation. However, you're in a recession, right? We all remember recessions. I know it's been a while, but 2008 was not pretty. 2020 wasn't pretty. The early 2000s were pretty. None of them are pretty, right? They're nothing that you want to experience. they do happen. They're a normal part of the economic cycle, but nobody wants them to happen. So if we decide we're going to beat inflation with a bat, we're going to make it, make it cry uncle, then they're going to keep raising rates until inflation is tamed, which would effectively at some point put us into a serious recession or even a depression. Those are the extreme examples, right? That's what either the Fed has to make a choice between these two examples. However, there's also gray areas in between. They're trying to split the baby, as you would say. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're saying, well, we can have a soft landing. We'll take care of it. Everything will be fine. I don't know anybody who thinks they're going to have a soft landing. I don't think we're at that point. There was a point in time where that was possible. We're past that point. So really what the Fed has stated is that they want to raise interest rates, which is good for savers, but it's terrible for consumers and it's terrible for the economy. And I want to point this out because I think a lot of people think that, oh, well, it's fine because once we go into recession, the Fed will lower interest rates and they'll pull us back out like they've done for the last 20 years. However, that's not going to be the case this time if inflation doesn't drop. So if inflation stays high, they're going to have to keep raising rates and keep them high, which is going to push us deeper into recession. So if you have to look for one variable in all of this, if you had to base your investing decisions, your household finance decisions, everything on one decision, it would be, what if the Fed is cornered and they have to make a choice? Are we going to raise rates? Are we going to save the economy? So far, what they're saying is they're going to raise rates, which means that we're going to see a recession. So if you're planning on us getting bailed out by the Fed anytime soon, you might want to make different decisions because this is why it's so important. It's a paradigm shift. It's not a quick fix. This might last up to 5 years, so you need to prepare for that. So the paradigm shift is not like a quick economic cycle, like, oh, we just, the markets drop 10% and then they bounce back. You need to prepare for something longer.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room.
So I know I went in a little rant there, Doug, but yeah, where do you want to take it from here?
Well, geez, there's a lot of ways to take it on there. I think, a simple way that I've heard, and I've said this before in a couple of these, is, when that velocity of money is essentially, because of COVID, a lot of money went out the door to people And a lot of it went into those savings accounts, like you were talking about. That now means that they still have a lot of money to spend. They're not just sitting on that money in the savings accounts. They're buying things. Buying, one of the terms I've heard out there is things like stimmy boats, right? Stimulus boats. Lots of good things. We have shortages because it was tough to get stuff through the supply chain that kind of got broken. That sand in the gears that you were talking about. But here's the thing: for years we had lots of money printing. We had QE1, QE2, QE3. We never saw inflation go up. Why did inflation not go up? Because ultimately, while you were sending this stuff and getting it cheaper from places like China, you're also building up their middle class, which meant there was more demand there, but we were manufacturing more. What people wanted, there was enough being produced to be able to support that. We went into COVID, just shut all that down. And all of a sudden that break, all of a sudden says you've got more people than we had 10, 20 years ago that have money to spend, but all of a sudden half the supply. And a great analogy is that if you had $10 out there that people could spend, and you got 10 apples, each apple is going to cost $1. If all of a sudden you have $20 out there for people to spend on 10 apples, it's going to cost $2 an apple right there. Inflation. Now, if you cut the supply of apples from 10 to 5, you just spike the price of an apple from $1 to $4 an apple. That's where it's coming from. So people, you're right. People, the narrative is it's got to be the printing of money. I mean, how many times have you heard that, Kirk? That people are talking about it's just got to be all the money they printed. Money printing's not a problem until there isn't enough supply to spend it on. And then everybody's fighting with those extra dollars for a limited number of goods, driving costs up. Sounds like what the housing's been over the last 10 years, right, Kirk? I mean, how many houses are there? Government keeps the interest rates low, or the system kept the interest rates low on mortgage rates. And all of a sudden, we saw a massive supply or demand for homes with a limited supply, and home prices kept going and going and going. Now mortgage rates have gone up. That demand has plummeted. People cannot afford what they used to. And guess what? Interestingly enough, Kirk, did you notice we're starting to see a little bit of shift on housing? Now, I want to go back to what you said about Europe, which I thought was interesting, because one of the things that they're dealing with their energy prices is not just that it is not just a natural supply issue that has diminished against that demand, but it was somewhat artificially cut off with what's going on between Ukraine and Russia and the pipeline. I mean, they're really dependent on Russia, which is not a great thing if you're going to band as a continent and get ticked at the same people that are supplying you energy. So there's a lot of talk about there with war. And so war is something that has casualties that are, body casualties, right? There's going to be people who will be injured through war, but there's also financial casualties, right? And you're starting to see that with what's going on with inflation. And let's think about this. What if the issues in the Ukraine and in Russia, and Russia starts to align with certain countries like China, and it starts to become an East versus West, battle again that extends into something like World War III? Well, that's going to be a real issue. There's people that are concerned about that, but Kirk, what kind of battle is going to be more dangerous to us? An actual battle on a battlefront, or a battle financially with inflation? I mean, I think there's some comparison here to think about, kind of the way war could be waged in this day and age. That's not just necessarily with bullets.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one of the reasons we labeled this session "Inflation is Worse Than World War III," which I know is a big claim, but if you think about it, there's two aspects to this, right? You have the Russia-Ukraine war right now, which is destroying physical structures, but yet Ukraine is still operating, right? They still have some sense of an economy. They have some sense of order in areas that are not under attack. I mean, obviously, I can't imagine what's going on there, so I'm not going to pretend like I do. But when you look at war destroys physical structures and it kills people, right? It's terrible, right? It's an awful thing, and hopefully nobody listening to this ever has to experience it. But if you talk about inflation destroys everything else. Inflation is worse because think about Zimbabwe or Venezuela or Greece or perfect example. Look at Weimar Germany, right, where they had that hyperinflation prior to World War II. It actually was one of the reasons it led to World War II, is because it effectively, when you destroy commerce, when you destroy the economy, when you destroy your currency, you effectively don't allow people to transact. So if I want to go down the street and buy a loaf of bread and I have to carry a wheelbarrow full of dollars just to buy a loaf of bread, that means that the economy is not functioning, which means that people can't transact, which means that they can't feed themselves. So destroying a currency with hyperinflation is one of the worst things that could happen. And so when I laid out those two scenarios, hyperinflation or deep recession or depression, hyperinflation is by far the worst scenario. Like, obviously I don't want to conflate, people losing their lives with money, but when you think about like the impact it has on everybody, it think of our standard of living today. You get in your car, you get to drive to work, you fill up your gas at the gas tank. Imagine you don't have a car. Imagine you do, but you can't fill it up with gas, so it's pretty much worthless. Imagine you can't get to your job. Imagine you can't drive your kids to school. Like imagine you go to the grocery store and there's nothing for you to eat. Like these are all things that happen in hyperinflation. So it's not just that war, one is better than the other. Inflation, it's hard to come back after inflation. You could always rebuild a city that's bombed out, right? And you can't replace lives. So I'm just going to push that to the side. Let's all agree that lives are not replaceable. Like, let's stop. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because it's obvious. But if you think about the rest of a war, right, everything that's destroyed, you can rebuild that. But when you get hyperinflation, you can't easily rebuild that. That's a loss of trust. That's a loss of faith in the government, in the currency. That's when people revert to barter. And that's what happened in Weimar Germany. Like people were reverting to barter. They were using things like, lipstick and, trading goods, something for another. Like it's a challenging time that none of us have experienced. And I think probably most people in the world haven't experienced it. There are a few countries that have and are currently. And I think there'll be a lot more. But it's a really dangerous thing. And I think people can't make light of this. You can't just say, oh, hyperinflation will be fine. They'll just figure something out. It's not that easy. If it was that easy, places like Zimbabwe, who had $100 trillion notes, you could have a dollar, it was worth $100 trillion. Here's a Zim note, $200 million. Okay. I have one of these. I have like 50 of these things. And if you guys want one, let me know, fill out a survey. I'll send you one, right? They probably cost me 50 cents. Okay. They're worthless. Okay. And that's one example. And you also have another example of Venezuela right now. They're going through it. Turkey's on their way. I think they have like 140% rate of inflation right now. And you're going to have more countries, right? You have right now gas lines in France. I can only imagine there'll probably be at least a handful more countries that are going to go through this before it's over. So it's extremely dangerous, and you should be aware of that. So if we look like we're heading into that cycle, and I'll give an example when that might happen, which is the Federal Reserve decides the economy is more important than hyperinflation. It's just like what happened in the 70s. And here's the thing that I want to kind of point out, because people kind of mention this but didn't really talk about it. The 70s was a difficult time, and it was difficult for many reasons. But one of the reasons it was difficult was because we had inflation, and the government decided, you know what, the economy is more important, and hey, I'm a politician, I want to get reelected. So let's just lower inflation, lower interest rates, and we'll let inflation take off. We don't care. We want to get reelected. And then what happened? Inflation picked up again, and it got so high it was in like the 20% range. Now, if you look at what's going on in politics, and I'm not going to get political, but right now is election season. We have an election in 2 weeks? So, midterms I think are in 2 weeks or so, 2 or 3 weeks. What's going to happen? All these politicians are out there talking about how they're going to forgive student loans and they're going to give people free money and all of this stuff. It's ridiculous. It's going to cause more inflation. I don't think they're going to do it. I think they're just pandering to their voters. But, if they ever did that, that would cause more inflation and make the problem worse. So all of the problems we have are only going to get worse because of human nature. and because of politicians being who they are. It's not necessarily specific people, although I don't think highly of any of them right now. I think since the beginning of time, politicians have been this way. So I think you should expect it. You should expect that they're going to do what's in their best interest and what makes people feel good, even though it's not the best policy. So, for an example, if you knew that higher interest rates for the next year would be very painful and send us into a recession, but would end this problem, versus keeping interest rates low and making everybody feel good for the next 5 years, but eventually we have hyperinflation. I mean, that's how politicians look. They're very short-term thinking. And I get it, they're trying to keep their job, but that's why things are going to perpetuate themselves, is because of human nature, because people are going to be screaming for the politicians to do something, and they're going to do something which is the exact opposite of what they should do. And one more example, and I'll give it back to Doug because I want another rant. An example of this is what's happening now over in Europe. You have electric prices which are 10, 20 times what they were a year ago. Here's something that I pulled a quote. The Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, was laying down the law in a meeting for his cabinet. He said, all price increases are forbidden from today, not tomorrow, today, so that prices aren't driven up in the next 24 hours. Are you serious? He's just going to dictate you can't raise your prices? How's that going to work? Good luck there. You're not going to have any bread in the store. No one's going to supply anything, because what happens is when you fix prices, that means that there's no supply, because people can't produce the goods at the cost they need to, so they just don't produce at all. So you want to put a cap on electric prices, it means you're going to have blackouts. That's just what's going to happen. So I think politicians are going to try it. They've tried it before. They know it doesn't work. They're going to do it anyway because they want to look good, and they're going to create more problems. So just prepare yourselves.
Well, Kirk, it's interesting because again, there's so many things to take away. But first of all, it reminds me of the old saying, for those of you that haven't heard it: if pro is the opposite of con, then progress is the opposite of Congress. So I think it's something you always have to remember when you're thinking about who's talking to you and who's telling you these wonderful plans that they intend to put in motion. And actually, I think, the Belarusian president reminds me of something we saw actually very, very clearly hit here in the United States. I think it was around 2001 that PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, ended up going into bankruptcy. It was the second bankruptcy in the utilities history. And the reason that they went into bankruptcy is that because California passed some regulations that said they could no longer pass any utility price increases to its people, okay, to the people of California. But the problem with that, and this will be the same problem that you would find in Belarus, is that it doesn't stop the costs going up on the goods and services that are being produced. It just meant they couldn't pass those costs along. And I can't remember exactly how long it took, but I think it was within weeks of the announcement of not being able to pass on those energy prices that there was such an increase in the price of production of the energy that Pacific Gas and Electric was stuck in the middle, basically suffocating under the raising of those energy wholesale prices that they couldn't pass along, that they went from solvent to bankruptcy within weeks. I mean, that's what happens. I mean, unfortunately, when prices go up on the back end of goods and services, somebody's got to pay that price. And if you collapse the whole system by not passing that along, unfortunately, you end up with much more than you had desired in terms of failures across the board. And that just, collapsed the economy. You're talking about Europe, talking about price. You talked about France, and France is, word coming out of France is they were doing quotas and checks. If you had, depending on how much gas you had in the tank, they wouldn't allow you to get more fuel for your car because they were reserving those lines, those rations, for those that desperately need it. Interestingly enough, if you look at Europe's energy inflation chart through July 2022, on the index of computer prices year-over-year, consumer prices year-over-year change, actually France is one of the better places in Europe. They're showing only about a 34% change in year-on-year price of energy. And across the board, it looks like most countries in Europe are around 50%. But some of the outliers, Belgium at 70%, Netherlands, almost 81%, Great Britain, which people have heard about having many challenges, 65%. So those energy prices are getting passed on. Maybe some of that's artificial, due to supply issues with what's going on between Ukraine and Russia, which doesn't seem to be ebbing anytime soon. But a lot of it has to do with some egregious policies that Europe had been ignoring for years. And another thing I saw talking about those increases in prices, well, that of course means, as you mentioned, Kirk, we got to raise interest rates. And I don't know if I've heard about this, but I think that we've had the fastest rising interest rates than any other time in history, Kirk. I mean, I know I've seen that on the news. I mean, have you heard that too? I mean, that it's been a lot of interest rate hikes over the last couple of months, fastest in history. What do you think about that?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about that, and we're getting into some of the news this week, because I think I wanted to set the stage for some people who hadn't kind of heard the beginning rant about inflation, but I want to get into some of the charts, and you were talking about one of them, Doug. So I noticed on LinkedIn that there are a bunch of people. One of them is a very notable economist, a name you've definitely heard, smart guy too. But there was a chart that he put out, which I assume wasn't him. I assume it was his team. But basically, the chart said, "Wow, this is the fastest rates." The quote was, "Rates are rising faster than any other time in recent history." Now, I don't know what recent means, recent in air quotes, but apparently recent didn't go back to 1979 to 1980, because they rose a lot faster during that period. But yet somehow, they decided that it had to be, right now is the scariest time in history. So I want to point this out, and I want to, offer this up as a lesson, is that we talk about this sometime, but probably in the next few weeks, we're going to dive into this in one of the episodes, and we call them investing half truths, right? So Benjamin Franklin said, half a truth is a great lie. I'm paraphrasing. I misquoted him a little bit, but basically, a half truth is something that it sounds true, sounds like it should be true, but it's not 100% true. Now, the problem is, if you think it's 100% true, then you just make an assumption and you build that into your assumptions, and then you never look at it again. And then when you realize, oh, it actually wasn't true, the whole system collapses. I mean, in part, that was one of the reasons why 2008 happened. It wasn't because banks are stupid. They're very, very bright people. What happened was everybody thought, hey, real estate never goes down. It always goes up. And as long as it always goes up, we can make lots of money. It's kind of like a Ponzi scheme, right, Doug? We're just like, oh, I'll just have someone else pay for this person. I'll be fine. I don't know how they're making 20% a year, but I don't care. I'm making money, right? So it's the same thing here, is that half truths cause you to lose a lot of money. And this is an example, and I'll show you the chart here, is the recent chart said, oh, 2020 was the fastest. Well, it really wasn't. If you add in 1979 to 1980, and if you just include 1980, it was over 11% within, let's see, I think they did it within 6 months approximately. And then there was another period, 1979 to 1980, was about 6%. And there was one more, 1973 to 1974, which is about 5% within 7 months, which is still faster than where we are now. Now, I don't mean to belittle where we are now, because it's not great. However, if you look at 1980, when they raised it 11% in less than a year, imagine that, Doug. Imagine that we're at 0% interest rates, and then by the end of the year, they're at 11 or 12%. Can you imagine what that would be like in our economy, that they decided to raise rates like 11% in a short period of time? Like, our whole system would implode.
Well, I think I can imagine it, Kirk, because that sounds like the 1970s to me. And I don't know. I mean, I know that a lot of people who are listening, it's funny because I've got friends that run mortgage agencies and run real estate brokerages, and they are, they in those brokerages, they've got individuals of many different ages, right? So they've got some guys that have been doing mortgages and real estate for the past 30 years, 40 years of their life. And then they got a lot of people who have not gotten into real estate until, since 2010. And they joke about the conversations that happen inside the office between those that have been through these cycles before and those that never have, and what they believe can occur based on their own lifetime bias, right? It's like, look, real estate never goes up. Real estate always goes up. Interest rates are just going to keep falling. It's all supply and demand. Since 2010, if that's all you ever knew and you don't know how to read a history book, you're absolutely correct. But the reality is, let's go back a little further. Let's go back and look at the 2010s, the 2000. Let's go back and look at 2007 to 2008. Let's go back and look at the 90s. Let's go back and look at the 70s. It's funny. I talk about this with my kids all the time, Kirk. It's unfortunate that social studies and history, so many kids don't like it. And the reason they don't like it is it's taught so poorly. You sit there and you look at a professor that says, all right, kids, next test, you're going to have 100 questions. You're going to need to know the exact date of every little nuance that's ever happened in history. And the kids are like, what? So they're doing flashcards, trying to get, they're looking at flashcards, trying to get things, lined up, ready for this cram exam. And they're like, I hate it. That history. Why do I need to know that? It happened in the past. Oh, social studies so boring. But if it was so boring, why would History Channel and why would Hollywood produce so many things that have such high interest on things that have happened in the past? History is fascinating, Kirk. Unfortunately, it's taught about as poorly as anything you can teach in school, because if it's actually taught about what the impact of events were, and if it's actually taught about what happened and what it was like to experience those circumstances, if it was taught about, the drama, nothing writes a good storyline better than history, right, Kirk? You can imagine all you want, but what happens is they don't teach it that way. So unfortunately, too many people are either ignoring history because it has been taught to be so boring, or they are only looking at the history they've experienced and nothing further. And they're really missing the very obvious signs about what has happened in the past that can lead to a really strong indication of what is and what is going to occur. It's all out there, Kirk. It's all out there. And right now, when you start hearing about gas shortages, when you start hearing about high commodity pricing, when you start hearing about high interest rates, when you start hearing about the potential of recessions, when you start hearing about stagflation, inflation, deflation, all those terms, it's not like we have to sit there and go, geez, we've never been through this before. What do we do here? There is a history book that's been written, and if you're not paying attention to it, you're going to get run over like people get run over time and time again. It's not that hard.
Yeah, I appreciate that point of view, Doug. And I'll point out there's actually a third category of person with history, and those that are generating a narrative. So they're cherry picking history, which is actually, that's the most nefarious type of person. And like I said, this chart actually shows that, because they just cherry picked certain data points. This is where the half truths come in, is that this happens a lot, is people will cherry pick data points that fit their narrative to help illustrate a story that they're trying to teach you. And frankly, I get it. It's a sales tactic, but you should be aware of it. If you're aware of it, then you're going to look at it and say, all right, great, this is only for the last 18 years. Well, what about the last 100 years? Why are you only showing me 18 years? Are you trying to hide something? I can't tell you how many charts I've seen that literally stop at 1982. They don't go back further than that. It's like they're deliberately trying to hide something that dispels their narrative. And it's fine. Like I said, if people want to do whatever they want, it just means you probably shouldn't be following those people, because they're not being truthful. And quite frankly, they're probably trying to tell you a story that's not going to help you. So,
well, Kirk, I want to say, the dad joke in me, and my poor kids have to suffer through this, but I love that, you mentioned that the half truths was a quote by, of course, Ben Franklin, who came out and specifically said half truth is often the great lie. And I like how you added this up by saying quite frankly several times there in your statement. So, obviously tying back to the narrative and the half truths that people will put to support what they are trying to sell you on. And we've talked about this. If any of you are listening, first timers, go back and listen to some of the podcasts that Kirk and I have done together, because we talked about this and we've shown charts before where you can take the exact same chart and put it side by side of the exact same chart, where one person is telling you that this chart is telling you a negative thing that's going to happen, And the same chart, somebody's reading it as a positive thing that's going to happen, or comparing it to completely different data. So ultimately, there is a lot of spin that happens out there. I think that if anything's been proven the last 2 years, people are certainly more open to understanding that spin exists. But definitely go back and do not and understand sometimes when you're being fed this data, or you're hearing the narrative, or you're listening to the talking heads out there saying buy, 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 sell, 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 that there is more that you need to be aware of about what's going on than just what they might have as their own bias. And also, in many cases, they may be trying to sell something ultimately, like the news does, to get you to click and sell advertising. But if you look past it further and you look at what smells similar, okay, again, the 1970s, it smells a little like now, right? There's utilities, commodities are a little bit more, or a little bit less available than they used to be. OPEC is squeezing supply. You've got the presidency that has been talking recently about trying to get OPEC to loosen up supply on petroleum so that they can bring prices down. When OPEC's saying no, well, guess what? 1970s was shutting off of the oil pipelines. There was a squeeze on the availability of oil, which ultimately had a tremendous impact on the overall economy. If it smells similar, then there's a lot to be learned from that. And so you should be going back, and you may say, well, they're telling me it's different this time. Well, some things might be, but if enough things smell the same, if you start to sniff the air and you could smell that acrylate smell of burning electricity, you probably shouldn't ignore that and go out there and say, hey, whatever, all the fuses are fine. You should probably start checking your extension cords, because there's probably a problem that's about to happen. Now, you may not see the fire yet, but that's where the old saying, if there's smoke, there's fire comes from. Don't be ignoring until you actually get burned by the flames. Start to do some preventative things today that will put you in a position to potentially weather what may come, if there's enough signs out there that are indicating that something is probably likely to come. And I think, that probably leads right now to an extension of this conversation, Kirk, is like, well, what should you be possibly doing to prepare yourself, given that there's a lot of smoke, that there's a lot of things that sound like we've been through, that smell like we've been through some of these things in the past. What do you think should we do? Should just go out and throw all our money into gold? Because I know gold was the place to be in the 70s. Maybe we should just throw all our money in gold. Maybe you should throw it in Bitcoin, because that's a store of value, I've heard. I mean, what strategy are those? The two strategies, and we should look no further for protecting our assets. Kirk, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question, Doug. Let's get into that. We still got a lot of charts to go through, so let's go through inflation and where people should be thinking about their investments. Obviously, we're not giving investment advice here, but this is how you should be thinking about it. This is your framework for how to think about it. So I think the natural bias for people is, well, when you have inflation, you should invest in hard assets. And people put in that category, they put gold and silver, other precious metals. I don't know. Some people like platinum. I don't. But, gold and silver are kind of two traditional metals that people look at. And then some people say real estate. Now, we're going to talk about real estate in a minute. But gold and silver actually are great inflation hedges historically. If you go back 1,000, 2,000 years, in ancient Rome, you could buy a toga for a gold coin. And as of now, I mean, things fluctuate so much, but as of today, in a close proximity, if you go to London, you can get a gentleman's suit for the price of a gold coin. So the price of what you're getting hasn't changed in over 1,000 years for gold, and it won't for another 1,000 years, in large part because gold is something that we have in our bones. It is a part of our culture. It's a part of our upbringing. It's part of what we value, intrinsically. If you look at our stories like Treasure Island, King Midas, all of these stories that you've been brought up with, it's all about how people love gold. And, people have been chasing down gold for centuries. Even in this country, we had the gold rush. Like, it is a valuable commodity. You got people like Warren Buffett saying, well, it's worthless because it doesn't generate income. He's right and wrong. in some ways, yes, it's not generating cash flow, so in a sense, it is worthless. But then again, so is our dollar. Our dollar is worthless too. It's just a piece of paper, right? Anything is worth what somebody is willing to pay you for it. The difference is gold has a very deep cultural value for many cultures around the world. If you look at like, China, India, or 1990s rappers, they all value gold, right? It's a part of their culture. And people in India, they wear their wealth. The wives, in many ways, wear their wealth around them in jewelry. So it is a very important part of many cultures. But what you should take away from gold is this: just because it's going down now, it doesn't mean that it's not a good hedge against inflation. I hear all the trolls out there, oh, gold's terrible. It's not a good hedge against inflation. Yeah, you could take any single day and say it's good or bad. What you should take away from that, and we're going to talk about this next week, is the dollar. The dollar has an enormous impact on the price of everything. Because if you're in the US, I know we have a lot of international listeners, but if you're in the US, everything is related to the dollar, whether it's gold, real estate, whatever. Dollar's going up, other prices are going down. Dollar goes down, the prices go up. That's just the way it works. So there's many ways we can look at it, and we'll talk about more next week. But I think it's important just to kind of consider. I think gold is still going to be a great hedge against inflation, albeit it's low now. But I still think it's going to hold up pretty well compared to everything else. I also want to bring out another historical context. If you look in 2008, gold went down with everything else. Everything dropped except for pretty much cash in 2008. However, by the end of the year, gold was positive. So while a crash took gold down, at the end, it came back because people saw the value in it. And I think if we have another crash, the same thing may happen. So you might want to look for opportunities in gold if we have a crash, because I think it'll hold its own, but maybe not in the crash itself. Also, other things that we like are farmland. Farmland is a phenomenal hedge against inflation historically. Also, just raw land actually does okay, although it's a little more illiquid. But farmland is great. It produces cash flow. People need to eat. Doesn't matter where you live in the world, you need to eat. So farmland is always going to have value as long as it's run properly. So I like farmland. But there's a lot of things I don't like. I don't think stocks are going to do well. Certain stocks will do okay, but most stocks won't. Bonds definitely won't do well with rising rates. And I don't think real estate's going to do well. I think we've seen that. And let's dive into that now, Doug, because I know we have some charts on real estate. Do you want to start us off there?
Yeah, well, we've talked a couple times on real estate in the last couple podcasts. So definitely go back and check out some of the things that we've talked about in the past. But yeah, what I want to talk about, and I kind of dropped it a little bit on that earlier, is that we have seen a massive, or at least not recently, but up until this year, we saw a massive spike on the sale price of houses sold in the United States. So going back to a 30-year fixed mortgage rate, what we saw for typically change from pricing, we typically saw the average sale price of houses sold in the United States and 30-year fixed mortgage. If you go back to 1975, the average sales price of a house had really kind of gone basically, up to, about a 40% change. It had been gone down, but it had been hovering kind of up, down, up, down, up, down. Okay. So if you go back to the pricing of residential real estate, back to the Civil War, and I forget and I apologize to those listening, I forget exactly who did the study, but effectively the appreciation on residential real estate since the Civil War had been about 3%, which, if you have followed inflation at all, it had typically been right there with inflation. Okay. So the place to sleep, not a place to make money. Okay. But that has become a narrative of the last couple of years, because we have seen with low interest rates, we've seen housing prices jump. Now, if you go back into 2020 to 2021, so unprecedented, going back to 1975, the highest change that we'd seen, somewhere around 40 to 50% change in pricing in real estate. And what had happened in those moments that it generally hit those peaks, we saw a tremendous drop in the change of pricing come not that far after. Well, guess what? If you look at 2020 into 2021, we saw the change of pricing spike 110%. Okay. That's incredible. And we've never seen anything like that. It's unprecedented in history. So all of a sudden, guess what happens? The houses become less and less affordable. People stretch trying to chase because they start to see the pricing go out, out of their range. And so they want to get in, be thinking that, hey, if I don't get in now, I'm never going to get in. But on top of that, then we've now seen a massive change in in the cost of buying a mortgage over the last 6 months. We've gone from what was effectively double the cost of buying a mortgage and new interest rates. So if it cost you $1,500 a month 6 months, 8 months ago, it's costing you close to $3,500 a month for that same mortgage now. Now a lot of people stretch their budgets to try to get in these homes. So if you're thinking effectively, it's, the rule of thumb is no more than 30% of your budget to buy a mortgage. It's effectively what you're doing. Well, guess what? If $1,500 a month or $2,000 a month was 30% of the budget for many, many Americans, and all of a sudden it's cost $3,500 a month for that same mortgage, you effectively wiped out demand across the board for housing. And so what that means is not only, and we've seen some studies that have said that there was a lot of regret for buyers last year. If you got into a house in the last 2 years, you may start to feel that between not only the mortgage costs, but renovations and furnishing and other type of costs outside your budgets, a lot of people have been squeezed. But now people are trying to sell their house thinking they're going to get these prices that are just going to continue to go, through the roof. But it's simple economics. If all of a sudden you've taken the price of a mortgage from $1,500 to $3,000, an extra $1,500 a month for that same mortgage, you have absolutely cut out a huge population. So those weekends where people say, I put my house on the market and I had 20 offers in one day, they're gone. They're gone. And that's why if you look at some of the charts that we posted, you have seen a massive shift city to city of the number of how quickly houses were moving. Where they were moving in days, now they're moving months. And just that reversal is absolutely staggering. I'm seeing it in my neighborhood. Houses are not moving like they were. Maybe they're selling, but right now you've got those sellers saying, I know I can get this price because I've looked over the last year or two and I know what I could get. And the buyers are saying, well, we're not there. And the thing is, there's a narrative out there that supply versus demand, that it will always be, well, people need housing. Well, guess what? Yes, they do need housing, but ultimately, guess who controls the availability of money for housing? It's the banks. And the banks aren't going to lend. The banks are looking at saying, look, we don't have the easy money from Fannie and Freddie. We're obviously not going to look at you and give you 50% debt to income. So they're not giving the money out there to buy the houses. So the narrative that says, well, people need houses, they'll just keep buying them at those prices. They just don't understand economics. Okay. Economics comes down to money available. It goes back to what we said before. If the money is available, then they will use that money to buy. And if the money's not available, you all of a sudden have a massive change in demand. And so what we are now seeing is you're going to see an astronomical change on the availability of money to buy houses. But that doesn't mean people don't need a place to live. So guess what's going to happen, Kirk? We're going to see a significant spike, and we're already seeing it when we start to see rent leases come due and people can't buy homes but need a place to live. Now you're going to have a massive demand for rent. And that's going to lead to what we foresee as a tremendous spike in rental renewal rates. Okay. So if you're paying, you look at some cities where they say rents were $1,000, $1,500, $2,000, $2,500. You could start to see rents coming in or being renewed based on the demand that's out there. You could start seeing those rents being renewed at $3,000, $4,000. Now, there's a breaking point for this too. I mean, that if there's a narrative out there that says this is going to start driving up rents, and that is potentially true. However, if you bring that back, Kirk, at some point, again, the same thing happens. I've only got 30% of my budget for housing. So what happens if you jack that rent on that person that could barely afford 2,000, jack it to 3,000? I think we're going to see a real issue here in the next 12, 18, 24 months where housing could be unaffordable to anybody because there may not be the willingness of people sitting on real estate to sell at a price in which the banks would be willing to lend to for the demand that's out there. But at the same time, they're not going to be, you're going to see a spike in evictions on rents as well because people won't be able to afford to pay the new rents. So anyway, I think that, there's definitely some charts that are showing what I've talked about there for you to take a look at. But I think housing is under a tremendous pressure right now. And if you look around your neighborhood, I don't think anybody that's listening to this would deny that there's been an adjustment over the last couple of months there.
Yeah, and we're in the interest of time, we're going to be wrapping it up here. I want to make one point. I think those are great points, Doug, is that, when it comes to housing, the way to think about it is this. We have a few levers that are being pulled. Now, normally in a normal market, you have interest rates, which equate to how much you're paying on the amount. And then you have the home price, right? And within that, they're usually, within reason of each other, right? Interest rates move up or down a little bit. That might allow you to pay more, which means maybe you can get the house for a little bit more expensive. Maybe you pay a little bit more for the house. We talk about this in the show a lot. If you want to buy at 2%, you want to buy a $700,000 house with a $700,000 mortgage, cost you $2,500 a month. If you pull that to 7.5% mortgage rate, it's $5,000 a month. So, these levers typically fluctuate with price and interest. And what happens normally is they don't move that much. So things kind of balance themselves out. Now, unfortunately, because of interest rates, they are going off the charts, and they've gone from 2% up to, I think we're probably in excess of 7% now for mortgage rates. And that's close to the 7.5, a double. But yet home prices, maybe they've gone down 5 or 10%, which means there's a huge imbalance. So at the moment, home prices should be 50% lower based on mortgage rates because that's what affordability would dictate. But that's not the way it is because homeowners don't want to sell for a 50% discount. They want to sell for what they think they can get, and they might ride it all the way down like they did in 2008. So I think the important takeaway here is that there is an imbalance between buyers and sellers. I think if you're trying to sell and you can get a good rate, take it. Don't worry about that extra 1%. Take it. Because right now, for what's affordable, I can afford half of the home price than I could have afforded a year ago. And that means that I'm not going to pay double. That's just ridiculous. Some people are because they have the money. I'm, being a smart consumer, I know what the value is based on what people can afford. I'd rather just wait. I'll wait a year, wait a 2, wait 3, whatever it takes for that to come back in balance. And I could say, all right, if it's in my favor, great. If it's not, no, that's okay too. I mean, if they dropped rates from 10% down to 2, I'd say, all right, now's a great time to buy because the house prices are going to be lower and the affordability is better for me. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's a big concept, and we'll talk about it more in the show because, I'm not telling you to sell your real estate. I'm just telling you how to think about it if you are close to that within the next year or so. But in the interest of time, I know we're running over time here, and I want people to be able to get back to work and back to lunch. So, Doug, where can people find more about you?
Thanks, Kirk. You can find more about me. I own a firm that does college planning for families. It is FAFSA season. It's October. A lot of families right now, seniors, are trying to figure out how to pick the right school, and obviously have their child, get into a school that they can afford. That's going to be a school they can get out in 4 years. And thrive. Walk off stage on Friday, into the career of a lifetime on Monday. This can happen. And ultimately, if you've got a child that's in high school right now, that's a freshman to a senior, and you want to learn the right truths about college planning, you want to know how to really get the scholarships, get your costs down, to make sure that your child is in the right school for them, that's going to rocket them to a career, an extraordinary career, then you got to take the steps to do that. You could reduce the time that you're going to invest on that by getting the information and getting the help. Check us out, ProCollegePlanners.com. Download our free report, download our free ebook. learn more now, because this college planning process can be much easier, a lot less stress, a lot more peace of mind if you know what you're doing.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us again, Doug.
That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us in Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.